Hello, this is part one of a three-part overview of the last 100 years and our understanding of resiliency. It's a little superficial in the sense that I cover a lot, but I want you to sort of understand the flow of our academic and popular engagement with the whole idea of resiliency. So in this part, the mind-body connection, we're going to be asking, how did we arrive at our current definitions of stress and resiliency? Like, how long have we had as popular and prevailing views the definitions we have now? What preceded them? Where is it going? Where is the new science taking us? And how does innate health address questions raised in the scientific literature? What is this emerging paradigm shift that addresses the issue of stress? So actually, if we look at the 100 years or so between the mid 1800s and the mid 1900s, there was an enormous movement away from understanding human psychology as a philosophical and sometimes even spiritual approach to going into it as a scientific pursuit. And we can trace that from, I'm just picking important figures, and I want you to understand in picking these pivotal figures, I'm certainly not giving you a detailed history. I could do, a whole course on this and cover, 50, 60 different people that contributed to the research, but I'm trying here to illustrate the flow of our thinking and just important milestones in how it started to shift from philosophy to science. So starting with Oliver Wendell Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes was at Harvard. A lot of the major figures in the evolution of the science were at Harvard or Harvard Medical School. And he actually thought that the mind and the body were connected. He believed that ideas, feelings, and beliefs could affect the body. And he was trying to get physicians to pay attention to how they were feeling, how they were behaving, what was going on with them in order to understand better their health. But he was, again, looking at it as a naturalist, not as a quantitative scientist. He was looking at it more from an observational perspective. And then along came William James, who was a student, actually, of Oliver Wendell Holmes. And William James actually was fascinated by the fact that you could implant suggestions in people's minds, and some people were more suggestible than others, and that you could actually induce physical responses, and then you could immediately reverse them. He actually experimented with that idea, and he actually also was the father of modern psychology. This is just the mind-body aspect of his work, but actually William James is the first person who said, psychology is in a search for principles, and when we find the underlying logic, the principles, will understand the human mind. Well, shortly after World War I, Walter Cannon came on the scene, and you can see he's the white coat scientist in this evolution. And you've probably heard of Walter Cannon. He wrote a book that a lot of medical students are familiar with and a lot of people in the healing professions are familiar with, called The Wisdom of the Body. And it was the first effort to measure the effects of stress. And he was looking at people who have responses that we would now consider to be PTSD, but back then they didn't have that term. But he was looking at the kinds of things that happened to people during war, and he studying the fight or flight response. He actually was the person who first talked about the fight or flight response, and essentially acknowledged that when people are startled, frightened, anxious, under pressure of some sort, their body chemistry changes and things, they're mobilized to take action. And he also conducted pioneering research into the neurohumoral basis of emotion. And essentially, that neurohumoral is a word that refers to the brain chemistry that changes when different signals are sent to the body. Well, then in the 1950s, along comes Hans Selye. And Hans Selye was trying to figure out what stress was when it came to people. And he is the person that came up with the word stressor to distinguish between stimulus and response. So in other words, stress was the response, stressor was the stimulus. And as I said in the introduction to the course, he kind of set the stage for the modern definitions of stress that we're still kind of using, because he really believed that external pressure caused stress. Although he really had a difficult time ever making the connection really strong between what he saw in rats and what he saw with humans. But the assumption that he made, of course, is that stress is created or generated by external factors, and it is the fundamental assumption that we have sustained as we've looked at stress and stressors. So remember that our whole understanding of stress really originated with the response that Selye's lab rats were having to things like having their little paws dipped in hot water and then ice, having operations performed on them without anesthesia, having various, it's really what we would call torture if he had tried this with humans, but at that time there was no regulation whatsoever on what you could do with lab animals. And Selye came up with a very, again, now sort of debunked, but there's a grain of truth in it, commonly describes stages in stress. So he said, first we have the alarm reaction, which kind of is Walter Cannon's fight or flight response. And then he described this phase called resistance, where we're fighting it, we're trying to fend it off. And then he described the last phase, which would be chronic, and it's exhaustion. And this was called the general adaptation syndrome. And essentially, the grain of truth is that he described the distinction between acute and chronic stress. Essentially, acute stress, acute means in the moment, essentially. When the alarm reaction and the initial resistance takes place, that's the body in fight or flight. It's the body deciding what to do and taking action to respond to the signals it's getting from the mind. And as we'll learn later, what he described as exhaustion, which is when you just can't handle it anymore, is what we now understand to be chronic stress, which is that we have actually induced chemical changes in our mind, in our brain, and which therefore result in chemical changes and physiological changes in the body without any outcome. So, for example, chronic stress would be being in the state of alarm reaction and resistance indefinitely without any opportunity to put an end to it. And more about that later, because that is the signal difficulty that we face when we look at stress today. Well, after Selye's book came out, his stress book came out, then of course the field of psychology got very interested in studying stressors, because right away you had a definition of stimuli, and what are these stimuli, and how serious are they, and are there differences between one and another, and so on. So Holmes and Ray, two researchers, came along and developed the highly influential social readjustment rating scale, which you can read about. And they were trying to measure people's response to life changes or stressors. And what they did is they interviewed thousands of people, and they had a list of things that could happen to you in life, and asked people to rate how they responded to them, how stressful they found them to be. And then they created scales. And if you've ever gone to the dentist's office or the doctor's office and taken those little quizzes that they give you in popular magazines, you know, you go through the list of if any of these 15 things have happened to you in the last 6 months, you check them off, and then you look at the bottom and it tells you you're very stressed, you're a little bit stressed, you're not very stressed, you're okay. And essentially what they're doing is using this Holmes and Ray research. It's, again, the source of that old saw that people would rather die than face public speaking. It's where our notion came that people are terrified of going to the dentist. There are all kinds of life situations that they've cataloged and categorized in terms of how stressful they are. But of course, they base their scales on medians, and no one ever questioned the outliers. And that's, again, pretty common in research. So you get this scale that's based on, you know, what a large number of people said. And it never asks, you know, well, why is there such a huge difference if you don't average it out? People are all over the map. Well, in the 60s and 70s, along came Herbert Benson. Herbert Benson is still very active at the Harvard Mind-Body Institute. And Herbert Benson was looking at, okay, we've studied stress, we've looked at stress. How do we understand when people are not stressed? And he started to look at what people are like when they're not responding to stimuli, when they're in a deep state of relaxation. And he actually created a whole body of literature around what he calls the relaxation response. And he actually got involved in a lot of scientific research that indicated that stress is immediately reversible, that all kinds of stress response activities within the body and the mind can change almost instantly when people go into a state of relaxation. So he's really the first person that came up with the idea that, you know, stress is reversible, chronic stress is reversible, things happen in the moment, that the state of relaxation is a healthy state, it has a healing effect on the body, and that this needs further research. He actually, the Harvard Mind-Body Institute, which is a very prestigious scientific endeavor at Harvard, grew out of Herbert Benson's research. And there's a very interesting sidelight to this. Herbert Benson is actually a cardiologist, and when he was young, he got very interested in, you know, how people can reverse heart disease and hypertension, the things that lead up to heart disease. And he took a group of graduate students once to study a group of monks in Tibet that practiced a ritual called the drying of the towels. And he was astonished by what he found. He really went about it in a very scientific way. So all of these people went into the mountains. It was freezing cold up in the mountains, the snowy mountains, with these monks. And there's video of this. You can find it actually on YouTube. And they, you can see the students are all in their parkas with their big gloves and their heavy boots and their fur-lined head topping, and freezing, you know, and trying to rush to the fire to warm themselves up. And then in these cold caves in the snowy mountains, the monks are basically naked, and they're wrapped in cold, wet cloths. And then they sit in a state of meditation until the cloths dry. And when the cloths warm and dry from their own body heat, they're unwrapped and they're placed in more cold, wet cloths. Now, by Herbert Benson's assumptions as a cardiologist, these people should have died of hypothermia fairly soon after sitting naked and being wrapped in a cold cloth in sub-freezing weather. But they didn't. their vital signs remained stable. And that's really, that was an astonishing discovery for Herbert Benson. He was so surprised by the fact that this was even possible, that from within their own capacity to quiet their minds and keep their body and mind in a stable state, these monks were able to withstand what he would have considered to be an external circumstance that would have killed them. And that's what led him to continue to study the power of the human mind. Well, then when you go from the 1970s up to the current century, you see a lot of people carrying on with this whole idea that, wait a minute, there's something deeper than just this body chemistry thing going on. There's something deeper than the fight or flight response. There's something going on, that the people have a strength that is misunderstood, if not understood, essentially, and that we need to be looking at that. And I would say that this whole movement is characterized originally by Robert Sapolsky, and later on in this unit there will be a brief tape of Robert Sapolsky talking about this. He wrote a book that I highly recommend, especially to those of you who are in medicine or in the more scientific aspects of healthcare, because his book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers is a scientific exploration of the effects of stress responses on various body organs and systems. And of course, the reason he explains why zebras don't get ulcers is that zebras don't live in the moment. They do live in the moment. They don't carry fear and anxiety forward. They get through something and then they're alive or dead. And if they're alive, they just go on. So you go through then Bruce McEwen, who is, as I will discuss in a minute, the person who discovered the whole notion of allostatic load and kind of took a whole new look at what stress really is. Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, who talked about flow. That's a very popular book, but also he's done a tremendous amount of scientific research into the way the mind works optimally. George Stefano, who is a neuroscientist at the State University of New York, who started to look at whether there's something innate, something inside of human beings that we don't understand yet. And of course, Sydney Banks, whom you'll read in this course, who is not a scientist, but who essentially takes all of this science back to the spiritual root of what is the human strength that starts to explain these different responses. So looking at Sapolsky, he basically says, look, the problem with humans is that we remember, and we can make ourselves sick. Now, Sapolsky does not recognize the logic that's going to be explained in this course. He doesn't recognize the fact that we can understand our thinking well enough to go about life in a totally different way. But he does understand that it's really important for us to realize why stress is so much at the heart of what goes wrong with us, and that turning on that stress response when there's no real stress to respond to and get over with is what causes a lot of human distress. So, and you've got an article that's coming up very soon from Bruce McEwen, but one of the things that he did is try to redefine how we respond to stress in the discovery of the plasticity of the brain. If you're really interested in this, there's a lot in the literature. It's technical and it's probably beyond the scope of this course, but you can certainly find it. And brain plasticity is a fascinating area, because essentially what's being discovered in a nutshell is that we have much more capacity to recover from almost anything than we think we do. that the brain is not as rigidly divided into areas as we thought, that brain function, that parts of the brain take over when you have a certain kind of loss. I've been to a lot of scientific presentations, mostly at the Harvard Mind Body Institute, from people who are studying brain plasticity, and some of what they have observed is amazing. And so Bruce McEwen has a very optimistic view of what is possible once we really understand how the brain works. And he also brought the term allostatic load into the scientific literature. And that's a really important concept too, and I'm going to talk more about that just so you understand it. So you have allostasis essentially as the way the body adapts to meet perceived and anticipated demands. So perceived, I think there's something that I have to do. Anticipated, something is coming at me, I'm going to have to deal with it. And so the body is, allostasis is when the body gets into that ready state. And allostatic load is how he determined the effects of that ready state on the mind, body, and spirit over time without relief. And relief is what we call homeostasis. So that is that if you, for example, in acute stress, in something that happens in the moment, let's say I see a child running into the road and there's traffic on that road. You know, I run, I get into gear, I run as fast as I can, I grab the child, I bring the child to safety, I bring the child back inside its yard and close the gate. It's over. So I go from a state of allostasis, oh my gosh, there's a child running in the road, I've got to do something. I rush, I run, I grab, I run back. I put the child back inside where he's safe, and I'm fine. My system returns to balance because the stress is over. I've responded appropriately. There's nothing more for me to do. Everything's fine. I can relax again. And this is a healthy stress response. But what if I'm walking through my neighborhood and every time I see a child, I think, oh my gosh, that kid is, the yard is so close to the road, and yeah, there's a gate, but the kid could be running in the road any minute. I've got to keep my eyes open. I've got to watch for these kids in the road. You never know when there's going to be a kid in the road. And I keep myself in a constant state of being worked up over safety when there is really nothing happening and there's nothing for me to do. Then I'm in that, I've got an allostatic load. I keep myself in that ready state of being of altering my body chemistry to be ready to do something without any return to homeostasis. Now, don't get frightened by this chart. If you stay with me, it'll all make sense to you. Because one of the things that we're going to discuss in this course is when people have a true understanding of how thinking works, of how they get themselves worked up and how to let it go, how the mind works, and what their role is as the thinker of their own thoughts. The higher their level of understanding, the less their allostatic load, that is, memories of stressful situations or anticipation or anything, can harm them. So what Bruce McEwen said is, look, if you've got a heavy allostatic load, if you've got a lot on your mind and a lot of bad memories and a lot of things that have happened to you that you can't let go of, you're going to be knocked for a loop because you're already on overwhelm when anything happens. And so, in Bruce McEwen's theoretical model of allostatic load, the higher your allostatic load, the less you're able to recover from new additions to that load, from new stresses. But in our view, kind of turn that around, the higher your understanding of your own innate resilience, your capacity to deal with this, was just what this course is all about. So don't worry if you don't quite understand that yet. Just understand as a concept that we can learn something, see something, discover something within ourselves that gives us the strength to transcend our allostatic load. That to the degree that we have, if you look at the left-hand arrow, an increasing understanding of that, our capacity to return to homeostasis, to balance, is much greater. So when an incident occurs, even if a person has a fairly moderate allostatic load, that is, set of memories and ideas and things that worry them or bother them or whatever, if they have a low understanding of where that comes from and that it's really just their thinking, their perceptions, they can get knocked for a loop if you look at the bottom line. And they can keep themselves in an increasing state of chronic stress because everything they add to that allostatic load just makes the burden heavier. And as their understanding of resilience increases, when an incident occurs, their return to a state of resiliency is quicker. So as with a little bit more understanding, they may be knocked for a loop for quite a while, as you see in the sort of magenta line, but they can return to a state of resilience and perhaps even feel better than they did before as they start to really see what happened. And with an even higher understanding of how our psychological functioning works, they may get knocked for a loop, but they quickly return to a state of resilience. And if they have a very high understanding, even with an enormous allostatic load, that is a long history of troublesome things happening in their life, they're very quickly able to get over things. And the thing that's interesting about this is, if you look at that shaded area, that's where all of our problems are. People with who don't understand that allostatic load is just memories. Is memories taken seriously over time, and they don't understand enough about their own psychological functioning to bring themselves out of stressful incidents. And that's where we're prone to stress-related illness. And if you look at that area, that's where all the trouble is. And again, I hope you'll return to this chart. And I'll put it back in the course later, because the more you understand this is a very important way to recognize why chronic stress is such a huge contributor to other illnesses in our society today. And one of the things that's true is that the body does not care how justified you are when you're having negative, upsetting, distressing thinking. In other words, the body responds to the brain's signals. It doesn't judge, that was a stupid fear. They shouldn't be afraid of that. I'm just not going to bother. The body doesn't have that capacity. So every time we send signals from our mind, and again, this is a very complex chart, but all you have to really notice is how many organs are involved and what the direction of the arrows is. Every time we send signals to our mind that induce anger or fear or anxiety or upset of any kind, it affects every vital part of the body. The chemistry changes immediately. And it doesn't matter whether it's a pointless fear, an unjustified fear, or you're being chased by a lion. The body will do what the body does. Now, Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, he came up with the idea of flow, and this is taking in a whole new direction because his effort was talking about happiness and creativity. He was part of this movement into positive psychology. And if you start to look at his work, what you see is that he is trying to say people are really happy when their minds are engaged, when they're creating, when they're productive, when they're looking beyond their own self-interest. And again, he had a kind of outside-in view of this, but the one thing that really, the grain of truth there is that when people are not worried about themselves and they're more connected to life, they are more at peace. And this was a pivotal book. This book was back in the 90s when it came out. It was extremely widely discussed in the field of psychology, and it became very popular just in the popular literature as well. Now, I mentioned George Stefano here for several reasons. One is that I know him, and I'm very interested in the work that he's doing. He works with Herbert Benson. And the other is that he's being very honest and saying, there is something that we don't understand yet. And he studies the placebo response, among other things, because he's looking at the placebo response as a healthy response, that there's something innately protective within us that that allows us to kind of think ourselves well, even when there's no real reason for it. And that's really important. I think that there's a lot being done now with the placebo response, and it's a very interesting field of study. And then, of course, we come to Sydney Banks, whom you will read in this course. And Sydney Banks is not a scientist. Sydney Banks is essentially a philosopher, but he is very interested in human psychology because he basically says, look, after William James, we abandoned the idea that the spirit was involved, that it was mind, body, spirit, not just mind, body, not just cause and effect, not just chemistry. And when psychologists stopped investigating the connection between the spirit, the mind, and the soul, they lost clues because they were looking at behaviors and not looking at the distinction, what makes human beings different from other creatures, in the sense that there's something we have within us that allows us to direct and redirect our own thinking, that we're not passive victims of life. And more on that later. Well, Sydney Banks began writing got very popular, I guess, in the 80s. He started in the late 70s, and it was pretty much ignored because he wasn't a scientist. So there was just a small group of psychologists who became very, very interested and started looking at what he was doing. And that's the innate health field emerging. And it got a lot of big boost from the HERO study in 1998 because the questions that the HERO study addressed were pretty ordinary. Do those at high risk have greater healthcare costs than those at lower risk? If so, how much greater? And what is the most expensive risk? So they studied 46,000 people across the country. It was a huge study. And they found that those with self-reported persistent depression had adjusted annual healthcare expenditures 70% greater than those who reported not being depressed. And those with self-reported uncontrolled stress had annual adjusted medical costs 46% greater than those who were not stressed. And this finding that psychosocial risks were the most costly was completely unexpected, and as I indicated in the introduction of the course, it was not only medically newsworthy, but it just set the whole field of prevention on its heels. It's like, well, wait a minute. What about smoking? What about all these other things? Again, I put a link to the HERO study in the course. You can look at it in greater depth. It's not, it didn't set out to be, it was really just a behavioral study, and it didn't set out to be the important study it turned out to be. But identifying stress and depression as the major contributors to healthcare expenditures really pushed the field to look at stress and resiliency much more seriously than it ever had before, because these are big, big numbers. And to this day, since we haven't really solved these problems, they are still big. Now, I'm going to give you an article to read that I wrote, which was published in Medical Science Monitor in 2005. But this was actually the first time. There's been more now since then, but this was the first time that a theory article about innate health got into the literature, and it's again provided an opportunity for people to use as a reference as they set up studies of innate health compared to other things and so on. But we're looking seriously now at resiliency as unrelated to externals, even though a lot of the research in the field of resiliency is still focused on external things that induce or encourage resiliency. Increasingly, the field is open to the idea that it may not have anything whatsoever to do with externals. It may be more like what the psychologist Dan Masden, who's at the University of Minnesota, calls ordinary magic, part of our life, something natural to us. And again, this is something that's important to me. This is a quote from Robert Sapolsky. When doing science, be very careful and very certain before pronouncing something to be the norm, because at that instant you have made it supremely difficult to ever again look objectively at an exception to that supposed norm. And I take the position, and I ask you to just consider that we have accepted as a norm the idea that the reason why we feel the way we feel is because of something outside of us that happens to us, that we live in an outside-in world in which we're constantly being buffeted by circumstances, events, others, external things that create our emotional and psychological states. And what if that is not the norm? What if that's a misunderstanding of what's really going on? That's the underlying question.